this on? Good evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for the launch of Lisa Ray's first book. Having read the book, I am certain that there'll be several more, and perhaps we'll all be gathering here every couple of years if AD would have us. When we received the book in office a couple of months ago, an early copy, a colleague of mine started reading it and came up to me and said, has she really written this? It's really good. I was instantly irritated, the stereotypes we have about women, about beautiful women, about what women can achieve. And I stayed irritated with this colleague for a while. Also because having met Lisa a couple of times over the last few years, I know how dedicatedly she was working on this book. I know she was at it since 2010. When I visited her flat in Bandra, she had this big fat manuscript on a desk in her bedroom, and it's all she wanted to talk about. So I knew she was perfectly capable of writing a good book. But then I read the book, and unfortunately, I had the same doubt as my colleague. Has she really written this? Because it's more than a good book. It's the kind of book that stirs you. It's the kind of memoir that does the heavy lifting for the reader to excavate their own synchronous emotions that Lisa writes about in the book, from love, ambition, hope, loss, insecurity, family, failure, all of it. Which is not to say it's all about emotion. There's a lot of masala in there for those who are looking for it. Right at the beginning, we have a young Lisa thwacking the son of an industrialist across his forehead with a shoe because he tried to grope her in his shoe closet. We have Lisa's formidable mother in a wheelchair accosting burglars who've entered their home, saying, "You want to kill me? What's the worst you can do? Kill me right now." The burglar is sent running away. We have the underworld, we have a Mr. X, we have flirting with Sean Penn, which was not what I knew about earlier at a Vanity Fair party. So, and there's this fabulous part that I call Lisa's Jab We Met moment with a happy ending. And I think before we even start the questions, I'd love for you to read that part just to set the tone of you as a 16-year-old backpacker in Croatia landing up at this doorstep.
Yes, thank you so much.
Gives you a little taste of the book in terms of, the storytelling and the anecdotal writing, which is, I think, restricted to the first half, and then we move on to more of an internal exploration. So, Lisa, I want to start with talking about structure and style. Because you've said in recent interviews that the way the story was told was as important to you as the story itself. And you really fought for that. You withdrew a really lucrative publishing deal, fought with your agent. A lot of things went down there. So what was your starting point in terms of storytelling? Who are the memoirists that you've really admired? Where did you get the seed of how you were going to tell the story?
That's a great question. So a lot of the memoirists that I have admired or that I've read recently, the one that pops to mind recently is something called Educated by Tara Westover. And I really endorse this book and recommend it to absolutely everyone. But my taste is that, exactly as Anindita said, it's not just a story, it's also how the story is told. The quality of writing, there should be a little bit of enigma in the story, that the places where your own imagination can perhaps fill in the gaps, where you can meet the experience of the author. So not every single thing should be spelled out. And I really obviously respond to writing. What I find I connect with the most is in a great specificity and getting very specific in describing taste, smell, the way that the light falls on someone's glasses. I actually find myself there, transported, but in that, I also I identify my own personal experiences. And that's really, really important for me, is to, in the very specific, we find the universal. and you find yourself and you find your own experiences. And so I wanted to also emphasize that, again, I imagine that there will be perceptions, obviously, about my memoir, and amongst them, which would be very legitimate, is that it's a cancer memoir, that it all has to do with my battling this disease, which I've been very public about. And in a sense, it's not. I do cover my cancer experiences, but that comes much later. Although, having said that, cancer was the launching pad for writing this memoir, because initially that's why I was approached to write this. And I was approached off of a blog that I had written called The Yellow Diaries, in which I chronicled my cancer experiences literally week by week by week. And I was using writing, which is something I've always turned to my entire life, to try to process and decode a very emotional, very challenging period that I was going through. So off of that, I was offered the opportunity to write my memoir. When I sat down and thought about it, I realized that I couldn't write about my disease in isolation from the rest of my life, because everything is connected with what came before, and it's also connected with a part of my Buddhist philosophy, which is something that has also deeply influenced my personal worldview and my healing. So if my disease does not happen in isolation from the rest of my life, how far back do I have to go? And I realized that I had to start from the beginning, and the beginning was actually my parents' story. So even though I actually start the memoir with describing myself, preparing myself to actually share my diagnosis of cancer publicly on the red carpet at the Toronto International Film Festival, after that I segue into my childhood, but more importantly into my parents. And this was a revelation for me in writing the book. If I had to pick a single revelation, something that I didn't anticipate, it was my parents, So as I said, I kind of fancy myself a bohemian, a rebel, someone who challenges the norm. Where did that come from? And I realized that it was passed on in what I describe my kaleidoscopic genes. My father's a Bengali, my mother's Polish, and between the two of them, they created this strange creature.
You go beyond your parents to your grandparents
and
as well.
And also to my grandparents.
So
Thank you for reminding me.
A lot of the book, you've spent a lot of time in setup, right? Starting from your Bengali grandfather, who was a judge, him sitting in his planter's chair in this palatial Calcutta home reading Jugantor, which is a specific type of intellectual, read that. And to your Polish grandmother, who divided the world into elegant and not elegant.
Non-elegant, yes.
So, which is what I wanted to kind of ask you next about how important context was to you, but you've kind of already answered that. In a way, your rebellious spirit and your kind of love for travel and adventure was something that your parents sowed in you. They picked up and just moved to Bombay and lived in ISKCON, which is a wild story in itself, when you were 16. And your mother was sneaking in chicken soup into the all-vegetarian ISKCON living quarters.
No.
So I think a little bit of your naughty streak is possibly from them.
And it's interesting because we normally don't frame our parents and our lineage in those terms, particularly when we're younger, We see our parents through a very different framework, They are more, perhaps sometimes, they're the rule makers, They provide a safe container for us, but they also provide borders and rules that you're not supposed to traverse. And, when I actually started speaking to my father, I said, tell me a little bit more, because he was always a little bit shy about sharing the entire breadth of my parents' romance, because it was not easy in those days for a Pole and a Bengali Brahmin to get together. Like, that was quite a spicy romance, but they would always kind of giggle behind their hands whenever they confronted them and questioned them about it. So I kind of pinned him down and got him to tell me about that, but more importantly, about how my father was essentially excommunicated from his family it was a very liberal family, a very educated family, but still excommunicated from his family for not marrying the woman of his family's choice. And how my parents had to then make a go of it independently. And the choices that they made, I think in any context, but even more so for the period in which they were living, you know, the 50s and the 60s, was extremely rebellious, extremely brave, extremely visionary, and very ahead of their times. But I did not see it that way. And today I can see that this rebellious streak, basically, I had no choice in the matter but to become a rebel and to basically challenge a lot of things. It was basically embedded in my marrow. From my blood, it was embedded in my marrow. And as I said, the choices that both my parents made and that I ended up making would both, I guess, they were provided a lot of blessings and a lot of trauma, both, you know. But, you know, that is the responsibility inherent in our lives, is we do have to take responsibility for our choices. And I do also want to say, Anandita, you had actually brought this up, that there's a lot of joy also, even though I write very frankly about a lot of the obstacles and trauma and difficulties. I've also studied a certain amount of, immersed myself in asking questions, not necessarily always finding the answers, but asking the questions, immersing myself in Buddhism, immersing myself in a lot of Osho's teachings, in a lot of, you know, going on a spiritual road trip, which is kind of wild, in a golden car, and not necessarily finding the answers, but in being able to accept the entire package of life, both the light and the shadow, and understanding and not judging it as good or bad, but this is the great glory of life.
Well, there's definitely a lot of humor in the writing. I mean, you speak about how the journey of your cancer treatment started off with learning how to floss your teeth. I mean, you know, one would expect something far more grave and serious from a person who's been on a spiritual road trip. I thought maybe you'll go on this final pilgrimage before starting the treatment, but you learned how to floss because that's apparently important.
Yes, because I had very bad dental hygiene before that.
So there is a lot of humor interspersed, and I wonder how all your spiritual lessons from Buddhism to Osho to your trips to Shirdi kind of added to that. But before we get to the spiritual part, which is a whole big chunky part, I would say that's the heart of the book in itself, I want to talk about the idea of leaving. That seems to be a running trope through the book. Lisa Ray leaving Toronto for more.
Like, share and subscribe to TVNXT Bollywood.